nature and nurture are really one and the same thing, seen from two different points of view.
An Englishman, an Irishman, and a Scotsman are in a pub on the 23rd of April, having a drink. The Englishman says, "My son's coming in later, it's his birthday. He was born on St. George's Day, so we called him George." And the Scotsman says, "Oh, what a coincidence," he says. "My son was born on St. Andrew's Day, we call him Andrew." And the Irishman says, "Oh, to be sure, fancy that. It's the same with my son, Pancake."
Nature and nurture are really one and the same thing, seen from two different points of view. And the idea that mutual adaptation in genetics lies at the root of the ethnos, or the ethnic group.
I am often accused by some of those commenting here of being relentlessly negative about multiculturalism and diversity. It's a fair criticism. We are told bluntly and often that diversity is necessary and desirable in Britain. But what is wholly lacking is the rationale behind such statements.
For the last 200 years, up until fairly recently, the Irish were the biggest immigrant community in the UK, but times change and Britain has changed. Indeed, over the past 25 years, since the election of New Labour in '97, Britain's undergone a profound demographic shift that has fundamentally changed the character of towns and cities across the kingdom. The fabric of many of these communities has been altered to such an extent that they're often unrecognizable to the generations that once called them home. From the old mill towns of the north to the heart of our capital city, this demographic change has created parallel societies of segregated populations whose daily lives pass with little or no interaction with wider society. Now, this situation is quite without precedent in our Long Island story. So how did it come to be? Well, it was infamously revealed by former Labour speechwriter Andrew Neither that a deliberate policy of the Blair administration had been to open up the UK to mass immigration. And he should know because he was the chief speechwriter for the immigration minister who delivered the landmark speech in 2001. And he said that the Labour Party's agenda was in part to rub the right's nose in diversity and render their arguments out of date.
In other words, perhaps diversity is a good thing, but many of us remain to be persuaded of this. We see the ill effects clearly enough and watch as our country changes before our very eyes, but we simply do not see why this is being done.
His connection of the ethnos, or the ethnic group, to the processes of social and genetic adaptation, both to the external environment and as well as to other groups of people within this external environment. This mutual adaptation is what creates an ethnic group. Ethnic groups are as natural as individuals are.
And they have released polling showing that British Muslims have a far stronger identity with Islam and with being Muslims than other comparable countries on the continent, which is quite surprising. 81% of British Muslims think of themselves as Muslims rather than British. In Germany, it's 66%, and quite surprisingly, given the troubles in France, it's less than half of that in France. Furthermore, whilst 6% of German Muslims and 4% of French Muslims sympathize with Islamic fundamentalists, in Britain this figure is an alarming 15%. Of these, 4% sympathize directly with terrorists and suicide bombers, and 4% equates to 120,000 people in this country.
He laid out a very rational, sort of a evolutionary and scientific approach to ethnicity, which is very hard to resist.
If the benefits are so manifestly plain, then surely the sensible and fair thing would have been to present this scheme in an election manifesto and set out the advantages of mass immigration to ordinary people. In other words, to tell us all openly why it would make our lives better than they are now. Then we could have chosen at the ballot box whether we thought the arguments in favour of the idea were sound. A debate could have been held about the way that the country's infrastructure would need to be improved to cope with the millions of people being brought into the country, and it could have been explained in detail where these people would live and the effects that they would have upon communities where they were to be settled.
What a nation is, what an ethnic group is here, is certain stereotypical forms of behavior. That these come from adaptation to your natural world and pressures both internal and external. It's a life cycle of an ethnic group. These are creations of the natural order, no different than the plant that's in front of my window I'm looking at right now, is as much a part of the natural order as the ethnic group.
Now, of course, it's important to note that the majority of young British Muslims hold far more moderate views. They're proud to be British and are well adapted, and that's to be celebrated. But they're not an overwhelming majority, because there is a very sizable minority of British Muslims who hold far more extreme views than even their parents or their grandparents, and that should worry us all. For example, and I find this absolutely amazing, over a third, 36%, of British Muslims aged 16 to 24 believe a Muslim should be put to death if they leave the faith. A majority also believe that homosexuality should be illegal, compared to only 5% in the general public. Now, should we be concerned about all of this? What does it matter to us in our leafy suburbs? Well, there is a correspondence between extremist views and segregation. Muslims who are segregated are about twice as likely to say they have sympathy for terrorist attacks. Now, Professor Ed Hussein, who was a student of Roger Scruton and a friend of our channel, came onto our show to discuss his book Among the Mosques. And he reported there that these communities lived in a parallel universe, and that many of these areas really were no-go zones for white men. And the mosques that dominate in these communities, and indeed further afield, are extreme radical mosques run by the ultra-Orthodox Deobandis, which is the organization that actually founded and gave birth to the Taliban. Riven with poverty and unemployment, and with no exposure to British culture and values, these communities often act as petri dishes for the cultivation of cultural practices which are abhorrent to our values. Honor killings, forced marriage, acid attacks, female genital mutilation, and so-called grooming gangs are all familiar to us today.
The plant that I'm looking at here has adapted to the life being in front of my house, in this environment, cold, hot, early summer, whatever it is, and only when those variables are just right, I see it. Well, the static person will say, well, this is how it is, I don't care, just, I have other things to do. Well, the dynamic person will recognize exactly how much goes into that. Civilization doesn't just happen.
The simple biological argument is this. People decide to marry, have children. They do it, generally speaking, almost exclusively with those that are like them, speaking the same language, having the basic customs, having the typical appearance and forms of speech and morals that they're used to. Overwhelmingly, people are going to marry those who are speaking the same language and have the same customs than a complete stranger, somebody who speaks a different language with different customs. Therefore, this is the genetic basis of the ethnic group.
In a democratic society, this would be the reasonable and just way to go about altering the very nature of this country. No such conversation has, of course, been held before a general election. Instead, both the main political parties pretend that they're going to be strict on immigration, while at the same time increasing the number of foreigners allowed into the country and failing to prevent illegal immigration.
But petrified by political correctness and beholden to the ideology of multiculturalism, governments, councils, police, and other public institutions have shown themselves unwilling to face the challenge and unable to admit that, however lofty the ideal, extreme diversity leads to division, sectarianism, and prejudice. From anti-Semitism to homophobia and misogyny, segregated communities are showing diversity's darker side. And you know, watching the BBC, etc., we're often told anti-Semitism is on the rise, homophobia is on the rise, misogyny is on the rise, yet no one ever actually asks why that is the case. It's the greatest elephant in the room. Remarkably, in some of these communities, children believe Britain to be a Muslim nation which is 90% Asian, because that's the world that they see around them. And in the year before the pandemic, 20% of Muslim households hadn't been in a non-Muslim house in the previous year. Now, who remembers Norman Tebbett's cricket test? These are the people he was referring to. These are the citizens who were born and raised in this country, but whose loyalty lies elsewhere. And we should regard it as a catastrophic failure on every level that so many British-born children too often identify with the land of their forebears rather than the land in which they live and call home. David Cameron called out the failure of multiculturalism over a decade ago, but talk is cheap. We're 2 more prime ministers later, and what's been achieved? I would argue nothing. So what incentive is there for a young minority to buy into Britain? What incentive is there to integrate when mass immigration continues unfettered, fueling the very communities in which they live? How can we expect young minorities to believe in Britain and the West when our media, our universities, our cultural institutions denigrate Britain's legacy and the West's achievements? When minority cultures are elevated over British culture, and when our students leave school with almost no knowledge of British history or civic values. In that context, who can blame a young boy for cleaving more to the masculine, well-defined culture of his father? Tackling Britain's segregated communities is among the greatest challenges facing this country in the decades ahead, for those communities are in the grip of an ideology and an identity that is every bit as strong and potent as anything Britain or the West can offer. Integration can prove a challenge even in strong, self-confident societies with small amounts of immigration. But without drastic measures for the UK, with each passing year, the opportunities for successfully integrating such communities into British society will only become more difficult, if not impossible. Despite our undoubted successes, mass immigration and multiculturalism risk hurtling us dangerously towards a future of sectarianism and social unrest. So what are the solutions? Is there any hope for Bradford and Oldham, or should we give up, abandon our great industrial towns and cities, and slip away to a peaceful corner of Albion? Well, it's a Herculean task, and it would require the sudden emergence of a political party or a statesman of immense courage, fortitude, and resolution. But there are a slate of bold policies that could greatly brighten an otherwise bleak horizon. Conveniently, some of these policies are already in action on the continent. For example, following Angela Merkel's catastrophic Syrian refugee fiasco, Germany now has a system of temporary visa permits for asylum seekers. But for true inspiration, Britain could do worse than look to one of Germany's neighbours, a country that long held a reputation for being one of the world's most tolerant and liberal lands. Denmark. In 1980, approximately 1% of the Danish population was non-Western. Non-Western is the Danish term for ethnic minority. Following the migration crisis of 2015, that soared to 9%. Now, that's still low by UK standards. We don't have the latest census results, but I imagine it's about double that in this country. But the speed and scale of the change in Denmark and the sudden emergence of segregated communities of impoverished migrants prompted much soul-searching by Danish governments and public alike. And I say governments because whilst Denmark's policies are deemed controversial abroad, in Denmark they've been fully embraced by both right and left-wing governments.
But that's not the only thing. The other thing is how this group of families, intermarrying one with another, develop not just in that kind of internal genetic way, but also the personality traits that they develop relative to their environment. A desert environment creates a different sort of person than a frozen tundra environment like Siberia or Alaska. The jungle will create a different sort of environment than a forested mountainous region. The more varied the landscape, the more specific problems that the landscape demands of a group, the more they require cooperation and in-group thinking, the better the chances that a very strong, healthy ethnic group will be created. This is the absolute core.
And this left-wing government has gone further than previous right-wing governments. Last year, for example, Denmark passed legislation enabling it to relocate asylum seekers in Africa. Yes, a year ago, socially democratic Denmark was pursuing exactly the same deal that Britain now has with Rwanda. It stalled a bit, and it was only last week, on the back of the UK's announcement, that Denmark actually announced it's also going to deal with Rwanda. All of this was done by a Danish Prime Minister who was a former trade unionist, an uncomfortable truth that Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner would rather not acknowledge, I imagine. So having followed Denmark in Africa, can Britain take further inspiration from Denmark's immigration and integration policies? Does Denmark offer a solution to Britain's woes? Well, perhaps yes. For a start, Denmark's been far more successful than the UK at reducing its number of asylum seekers. It did this by enacting a number of strict immigration policies, including a dramatic cut in benefits. There was a 50% cut for all asylum seekers, and their benefit is now called an integration benefit. They also, rather controversially, ran a series of ads in Lebanese newspapers saying, "Don't bother coming over here." And even more strangely, perhaps, in 2017, Denmark passed a law called the Jewelry Law, which saw the state confiscate assets of asylum seekers over the value of £1,000 to look after their care and maintenance. And whilst Denmark did give early refuge to about 30,000 Syrians early on in the war, by 2019 it had decided that it would return Syrian refugees back to the homeland once the conditions were safe, and that process is now underway. To quote one critic of Denmark's policy, "Everything the Danish state has done is about scaring people away from Denmark. The message is, stay in Germany, stay in France, everywhere else is better than here."
I know that some people who comment here accuse me of stirring up hatred and division. This, then, is the chance for those people to make their case.
Yet, despite these dramatic reductions, Denmark's Prime Minister is still not content. Her official stated aim is to reduce the number of asylum seekers to zero. Now, can you imagine a British politician making that claim? The Danish measures, unsurprisingly, have seen the country hauled before the European Court of Human Rights, but the policies have worked. 1,500 people applied for asylum in 2020. 1,500 people applied in 2020, the lowest number since the 1990s. It's a policy which every country in Europe has been looking at but hasn't been brave enough to introduce. But controlling immigration was just the first key stage of Denmark's plan to tackle segregation. Now, it seems obvious to say he needs to tackle immigration, but in this country it seems as if we can't grasp the fact that when there's a flood, you need to turn off the tap if you're going to deal with the flood. But with its borders now secure, Denmark's current focus is on eliminating its segregated communities, which it calls ghettos. And it's a unique experiment that hasn't been tried anywhere else in the world, and I'm sure it's been quietly observed in Downing Street. Ghetto is a controversial term in the Anglosphere, I know that, but it's actually an officially designated term by the Danish government. But for the Danes, a ghetto is defined as an area which has a 50% majority ethnic population or non-Western population, in which there's also high crime, unemployment, and high degrees of poverty. Since 2010, all ghettos have been listed on an annual ghetto list. Today there are about 30 of them. But if a ghetto has been on the list for 4 years, then it goes into special measures and is deemed to be a severe ghetto. In 2018, the government presented 22 strategies, all designed to eliminate ghettos by the year 2030. And a key government target here is to ensure that in any neighborhood, non-Western immigrants never amount to more than 30% of the area's population. Again, an astonishing move for a liberal democracy.
The most successful ethnic groups, the ethnic group that are going to develop and thrive, are those, number one, who really stress cooperation. Society has to cooperate and has to develop a moral system that stresses cooperation in order to survive, especially when the environment is particularly hostile. So if an ethnic group survives a hostile environment that does not have many natural resources, and they're forced to use their wits to survive, this will create a very tightly knit, healthy ethnic group. This is a classic example of how an organism has to develop in order to survive. It creates a nation. It creates something like an extended family. And this is how it survives.
Can Britain learn from Denmark's example and tailor these policies to our unique situation? Well, I hope so, because our situation is, after all, far more dire than theirs. The policy of uncontrolled mass immigration unleashed on this country by Tony Blair and New Labour was the greatest act of national self-harm in the history of our kingdom. It was a cavalier, back-of-the-envelope policy whose devastating long-term consequences had not been given the slightest serious consideration. And I can't think of a more reckless or a more dangerous decision. That successive Conservative governments have effectively continued this policy is, I think, as scandalous as it is shameful. And it may be that the best course of action is for a new patriotic party/lobby group to be founded, not with any serious intention of getting elected to Parliament, but to hold the Conservatives' feet to the fire and threaten their chances of securing a majority in the future. Such a party might just achieve for immigration what UKIP did for the referendum, what the Brexit Party did for Brexit. So have faith in Britain. If the public and political will are there, solutions can be found. Thank you.
In case there's any doubt about what I am asking, it is this. We are assured that diversity is an unalloyed good. This means that when a town which was previously entirely white finds that a large number of black people, those of South Asian heritage and others from Eastern Europe, move into their town, this is a desirable phenomenon which benefits everybody. What exactly are the benefits? Why is such a multiracial society better than one which is homogeneous? Many people see disadvantages, but the advantages are elusive. What are they? What are the advantages? Are they financial, social, spiritual?
Basically, biology, chemistry, genetics, this is at the root of the ethnic group. It is not just a social creation. Academics, at least in my field, they have to give their occasional symbolic slogans against nationalism. And you have people like Eric Hobsbawm, who is a Jewish communist, a Jewish Marxist, who was a professor specializing in nationalism, and he invented this idea that ethnic groups are just inventions. leaders, bureaucrats, they create the nation so as to justify their power. And that is his argument, and that has been the basic argument against nationalism for all this time. But the fact that a Jewish communist, quite the nationalist himself, by the way, when it comes to the Jews, a communist sympathizing with the USSR like Hobsbawm can be considered the leader in nationalist studies is really quite frightening. It shows you how corrupt and how bad things have gotten.
Tell us about the good points of such changes in our towns. This really is a chance for a dialogue, because I know that there are some great fans of diversity commenting here, and they now have the floor, as it were. Instead of simply denouncing me as a racist and sower of discord and hatred, they may now explain publicly where I have gone wrong.
All of the attacks on nationalism, if you apply it to the individual, the family, will destroy that too. And there's nothing left. The individual is, as we learned with Hegel, is a product of natural development. It's a product of natural law. It's a product of social development in genetics and what Vernadsky would call the new sphere, energy and the constant interplay of things that we're not even aware of at any given moment. The tremendous complexity that can permit even a simple civilization to function. All of this before we can utter a word.
If diversity is such a marvellous thing, then I imagine it should not be hard to point out why a mixed society is better for everybody than one sharing just one religion, one culture, and belonging to a single ethnic group. I feel instinctively this is the kind of society which I prefer. But I may be wrong. Why am I wrong? I must say candidly that I am surprised that those who regularly criticise what I say here have not taken the opportunity, without my explicitly asking them to do so, to make the case for diversity. One might have thought they would have done so already, and so made a lot of what I say here look silly and pointless. Well, this is a chance. I am genuinely ready to debate this point, and you can explain to 147,000 subscribers why you are in favour of immigration and diverse communities. One tip: don't bother with rhetorical questions or anything high-flown and fancy. Let's have some plain talking about this subject.
The national reality, the nation, the ethnic group, is defined in how its parts work together.
You have to keep flooding the institution every year. You've got to get more and more in to keep the entire thing afloat. But of course you get to a saturation point, and we long ago passed it. I mean, to put it into some context, everybody talks about the Ugandan refugees. A great moment when they were fleeing Idi Amin. We took in 27,000 immigrants, and that, of course, was a huge number by the standards of the day. Everybody was alarmed by it. That comes in now every 2 weeks into our country. The equivalent of the Ugandan refugees is every 2 weeks. We've had more immigration to this country in the last 25 years than in the last 2,000 years combined. So whenever people tell you Britain's always been a nation of immigrants, no. Under the Romans, there were 3% of the country was born abroad. Under the Normans and the Vikings, it was about 5%. But then for the next 1,000 years, it was around 0.5. In 1851, it was 0.5%. Then it was 1.5. In 1951, it was 4%. 2001, 8%. Then it's gone up to 14, 15%. Who knows what the latest census is going to say.
Thank you very much, Ray, for an incredibly cogent argument made there.